Fire, plants, herbaria, dump, the elemental fourfold of my thought. We live in an age of fire. The list of its political manifestations is long. The image of revolutionary sparks, ready to ignite the spirits of the oppressed, and car bombings or self-immolations at political protests. Wars and incendiary speech meant to incite hatred toward others. The melting pot of immigration and political kitchens where policy matters were decided by the tightest circle of ministers. But something else is going on with the politics of fire today, something worth reflecting upon so as to realize where our world ablaze is heading. The prospects of the entire planet going up in flames are at their highest. Global heating, well in excess of internationally agreed upon limits, and continued reliance on massive incineration of matter for energy production. The warming not only of the atmosphere but also of the oceans. Hybrid warfare, now involving AI, and the recently reignited nuclear arms race. Inflammatory rhetoric immediately going viral thanks to the pervasiveness of information technologies, are so many signs of a devastating fire, swallowing up not only the world, but the Earth itself, with its atmosphere and ecosystems, habitable places, and previously inaccessible fossil reserves. The forest fires that have been raging everywhere from Canada to Spain and Portugal this summer are a case in point here. We are no longer sensing the transformative positive effects of fire, be it the flames of technology or be it a revolutionary conflagration capable of instituting another economic and political mode of existence. In combination, the reignited arms race and the non-enforceable nature of international climate treaties amount to a scorching heat devoid of any light. The contemporary flames have a decidedly apocalyptic feel to them. This is the case in part because the ashes they produce are not fertile. They suffocate rather than nourish the very possibility of the future. The byproducts of mass-scale industrial activity and nuclear waste are just two examples of such death-bearing ashes. Devastating as they were, scorched earth warfare tactics still contained the promise of a new beginning in the future, bearing as they did a close resemblance to the myth of the phoenix, reborn from the smoldering remains of its previous life. Today's scorched world no longer sustains this hope. The world comes into view as a whole precisely when it is ready to burn up all at once. And the technologies responsible for global heating, as much as those that may result in a thermonuclear war, are making this terrifying vision of the finite world sharper than the catastrophic history of the two wars in the 20th century, known as the World Wars. The end of globalization is heralded by ultra-nationalist far-right movements that nonetheless maintain clandestine ties among them and represent the old-new face of capital. Is it by sheer chance that this contrived end coincides with the technological potential to wreck the world as such in its planetary extent rather than the separate worlds of particular civilizations or peoples? Another cause for despair is the relation to all matters fiery by politicians of every stripe. On the one hand, technocratic governments, mostly in the West, whatever this disoriented orientational term means in light of the inclusion of Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, are all but resigned to their own incapacity to regulate the fires of global heating and public affect, actual forest fires, and the feared flames of a nuclear holocaust. Instead, they dedicate themselves to the futile task of temporarily putting out some local fires, while others are ignited and still others rage uncontrollably. Despite their managerial approach to governance, they ultimately deal with the unmanageable. On the other hand, right-wing populisms and neo-fascisms thrive on fanning the flames of every conflagration imaginable, from hatred toward the other and the foreign to the blaze of global heating, given the unrestricted and indeed increased extraction and combustion of fossil fuels. Whether due to the incapacity or due to the unwillingness to regulate their intensities, fires of every kind imaginable rage and ravage the planet. More than that, we live in an epoch when fire, or more precisely its use, comes into its own, dispelling the daydream that once unleashed it can be easily controlled. Political and ecological fires appear terrifying and overwhelming, their elemental nature coming to the fore. Perhaps this is a final footnote to the Promethean endeavor, which was based on a desire to control fire, on harnessing its explosive potentiality and placing it within definite spatial or purpose-oriented constraints. From the steam engine to nuclear fission, industrial and post-industrial production of energy and much else relishes its illusion of control, while spawning uncontrollable side effects ranging from CO2 atmospheric pollution to runaway chain reactions and non-disposable nuclear waste. What is gradually changing is not the sudden eruption of uncontrollability itself, but awareness about it, though there is still plenty of hope around that technological solutions could be found to the multiplying crises, reinforcing one another in positive feedback loops. In light and in the heat of the current conflagration, it is easy to succumb to irresistible despair. But necessity is the mother of invention, and the turning point lies not so far from the point of sheer disappointment, despondency, and gloom. So what if we did not have to burn anything while still procuring enough energy? An apparent utopia, this has been crucial to the life of plants for millions of years. In their practical relation to fire and to energy, they demonstrate an evolutionary realization that it is redundant to burn anything here on Earth because the daily blaze of the sun caters to all energy needs in abundance. Plants do not rebuff fire, but merely displace it in time and cosmic space. Vegetal receptivity to the sun, to its light and heat, is an alternative to igniting fires, with the proviso that a few tree species such as eucalyptus actually welcome an earthly fire as well. If necessity is the mother of invention, then there is no need to invent anything yet unseen or unheard of, merely to learn from plants how to recalibrate our relation to energy and to fire. Politically, plants are not the absolute sun worshippers they are made out to be. They are not the conduits of the cosmopolitical figure of the one, God, King, Star. Even as heliotropes, or the flowers that follow the movement of the sun across the sky throughout the day, they stretch up, down, and sideways at the same time, anarchically dispersing the principle and the political principle thing, the authority, among several elements. The new shape of the politics of fire is as sharp and discernible as it is still vaguely unrecognizable, depending on whether the vegetal recalibration and moderation of fire is on the horizon. Much hinges on the plant's own relation to fire on the Earth scale and on our relation to this relation. Will the living and the long-dead forests, those converted into oil, coal, and natural gas, be engulfed in the flames burning up the entire planet? Or will the growing, metamorphosing, decaying plants lead the way in renegotiating the approach to, as well as the applications and implications of, fire for the sake of a livable future? There is perhaps no other place better suited for raising and contemplating these questions than the place where we are now, Terra dei Fuochi. It is, as I've mentioned in the title and the description of my talk, the elemental fourfold of my thought, involving fire and the dump, as well as their indirect transformations in plants and herbaria. We've talked about fire and plants briefly. Now, allow me to say a few words about the dump and herbaria. The dump, too, has already made its discrete appearance here in the guise of the byproducts of mass-scale industrial activity and nuclear waste, as two examples of death-bearing ashes. Briefly put, when it comes to its scope, dump exceeds the limits of regional ontologies, that is to say, of specific regions of being, such as the psychological, the physiological, the economic, or even the ecological. In the 21st century, it is the name for being as such and as the whole. Specific dumps, such as the one where we are now, are intense concentrations of a more pervasive planetary tendency, a tendency of being itself, as I've suggested. If in its supplanting of being and its sway over the categories and forms of sensible intuition, the dump resembles a totalizing metaphysical concept, that similitude is not fortuitous. The dump is a pervasive, warped realization of age-old metaphysical desires to behold unchangeable reality, immune to any eventualities in the empirical realm, and orchestrating behind the scenes everything that takes place on the world stage. The material instantiation of these fantasies renders them nightmarish. Masses of data, emissions, and non-decomposable products are the epitomes of Plato's ideas, Aristotle's unmoved mover, Augustine's God, Spinoza's substance, Descartes' subject, Kant's thing in itself, Hegel's spirit, Nietzsche's will to power, clogging the world and undermining its livability. The dump itself is the embodiment of Plotinus's one. The legacy of metaphysics inheres not only in philosophical texts, but also in the physiological and psychological, social and elemental, environmental and economic realities of the 21st century. That is why it is insufficient to deconstruct this legacy intellectually, when its colossal residues persist all around and within us, molding whatever remains of the world and of worlds. Finally, herbaria. Over the past 10 years, I published 2 books that have herbarium in their titles and that work as herbaria of sorts. They are the prehistory of the current living herbarium, which Anaïs Tondeur and I are developing here in Terra dei Fuochi. The first, The Philosopher's Plant, an intellectual herbarium from 2014, aimed to narrate the alternative history of Western metaphysics, arranging some of its main protagonists from Greek antiquity to our days in a herbarium of 12 specimens, each thinker corresponding to a particular plant. The specimens I selected held some significance for the lives of philosophers who were included in the collection, or alternatively they appeared in their works, often as fleeting but ultimately very telling examples. Just think of Plato's plane tree in Phaedrus, or Kant's tulip, the beautiful flower that blossoms on the pages of the Critique of Judgment. Why did the philosopher's plant have to be an intellectual herbarium? The answer is simple. Rather than cast a panoramic gaze over the history of metaphysics, I selected, arranged, and displayed some of its most prominent representatives. And rather than emphasize the deep conceptual connections among them, I pointed out certain family resemblances running across their genealogical tree. I do not mean this metaphorically. What I tried to do was to treat thought and its products as growing, decaying, and metamorphosing, in a word, as sublime and sublimated plants that, thanks to their decay, became cultural compost, nourishing the future of thinking. I therefore tried to tell the story of metaphysics in a non-metaphysical form or style, arguing against it in the very presentation of its contents. The second herbarium, bearing the name of a place and of an event, appeared in 2016, marking the 30th anniversary of the nuclear disaster that took place in Chernobyl in 1986. There, 30 thought fragments and photograms of irradiated plants created by Anaïs Tondeur were loosely gathered, staging the spectacle of what I then called an exploded consciousness. As I rode there, besides the plants that have grown in radioactive soil, the shards of our own exploded consciousness are reassembled in this herbarium, albeit not glued together, neither mended nor healed. In the fallen leaves and trees of Chernobyl, we can discern fragments of ourselves, of our bodies and thoughts. So a herbarium, despite its classificatory and perhaps systematizing endeavor, is necessarily something fragmented and fragmenting, a forever unfulfilled wish to save, to preserve, for instance by drying up leaves, flowers, or entire plants, that on each of its pages, regardless of a variety of specimens, displays the same shape, the shape of death. What herbaria ultimately preserve is not only vulnerable and fragile, it is also, and above all, fragility itself. So herbaria also have an upside of accentuating everything that Western metaphysics considers dispensable. The surface, contact between surfaces, a visible form, color, the physicality of appearance. Could we imagine, perhaps, herbaria as the tools of immanent resistance to the metaphysical drive whence they have originated?